So we are going to be talking about whether or not we can start trusting machines to make critical business choices. This is going to be a pretty far-ranging discussion. We want to definitely hit on at least 6 subtopics here, starting with balancing human intuition with generative AI recommendations, diving into evaluating AI's decision-making accuracy, learning from generative AI failures, specific examples that our panelists are willing to share with us today, over-reliance on AI and the risks associated with that, and then having and opening it up around a future discussion and some of the things that the distinguished gentlemen are saying and that they're really excited about. So with that, let's start with balancing human intuition and general generative AI recommendations. So Arvind, how should enterprises strike a balance between human intuition and AI-driven recommendations in the decision-making process? And specifically, if you have any examples you can share, we'd love to hear those.
Yeah, I think, can everyone hear me? I guess, okay, I can hear myself, so that's good. I think the important question here is we still remain amidst a lot of uncertainty, complexity, the need to connect different streams of insights. So, I think the human will always have a role there because we know AI does pretty poorly when it comes to complex information, uncertain environments. I think, it's fairly clear in generative AI that LLMs tend to do better with language and text than they do with numbers. There's also a need, I think, in the talk this morning, there was a mention around framing the question before running to solve the problem. And that speaks to contextualization and how you go from the start of a query process into what should the next set of queries be, which co-pilots are increasingly doing. And so there is a lot of utility, I think, to machines in terms of not just the solution, but also the process to go from start to the solution where we can learn, I think, a lot, right? So I do believe there's a place for both, and I think increasingly in businesses, we are seeing kind of that augmentation role. We always go to errors, obviously, but I think there's a lot of focus on AI errors without taking into account human errors. And so I think it's important we kind of assess how does AI do with errors compared with humans. And I think you can measure AI errors probably better than you can human errors. So I would say, I think machines will always have a place, but they're never going to complete tasks. They're probably going to simplify tasks, and that's going to be the journey forward.
Yeah, that's an interesting point because I do feel like people are keeping tabs more on the AI errors than they are on human errors. That's interesting. Venkat, how do you see that balance being struck?
Yeah, specifically in generative AI, we're talking about generative AI. We've been using machines for decision making in the sense of typical models in ML trained models and predictive models for a while. We know what the accuracy of those models are, how to actually test them, verify them, and look at its appropriate usage. But when it comes to generative AI, there are a lot of use cases. We're talking about hallucination before. There's a spectrum of use cases. I come from a company, TransUnion, where we are operating in 30 countries with highly regulated consumer data, making consumer decisions. We're not anytime soon going to talk about anything using generative AI and any models that predict consumer score that needs to be highly explainable, right? Why we've given that particular score to a particular person. So those areas are out of scope. But what in a large company with a large amount of data, petabytes of data across billions of consumers in 30 countries, we have a lot of knowledge workers. These knowledge workers do a spectrum of activities across the data analytics value chain. Think about onboarding thousands of data sets and billions of records of data every day. Think about connecting that data and identity resolution. Think about, so all of these knowledge workers use tools today platforms that we've built for very low code operation. What's happening now is the best use cases that we found is productivity enhancements for these knowledge workers, agents for working, combating the hallucination that we talked about, RAG-based agents, retrieval augmented generation-based agents that actually focus on the information that we feed it, the documents, the things that we feed it. How can you enhance and boost the productivity of these knowledge workers to onboard more data? How do you take these patterns that we've already identified and made it in low code into an agent-based conversation, multimodal conversation? So these are the areas where we're finding very quick use cases to prove, but because these are human enhancements, we can have the confidence in the productivity enhancements, the testing and the confidence to move into production. In a very platform-centric way, RAG-based agents that boost productivity enhancements across this. And we're seeing some great success in the amount of productivity boost in these years. It's an already very low-code platform that has very pattern-based thinking through a previous gen systems, boost with AI-based agents, RAG agents.
That's a fantastic example. All right, well, let's shift into evaluating AI's decision-making accuracy now. Arvind, I know that you have a technical example that we want to dive into here, which I want everybody to get their pencils out. So specifically, the metrics and frameworks you're using to evaluate the accuracy and the reliability of the decisions made by AI compared to human judgment, and how you're addressing those discrepancies.
Yes, so I think this is the topic of the day, right? And I know Krishna spoke to it quite eloquently on the work that he's done at Meta. And I know he touched on AI observability, but if you go into also what they're doing with explainability and using like shapely values, it's really taking prediction and accuracy to another dimension, right? So if you look at what's happening with causal graph models, right, and the whole issue of counterfactual logic that's coming into machine learning, I mean, these are trying to take accuracy to the next step, and not only that, they're inching towards trying to get more causal and real in the explanation, which I think adds to the trust behind the modeling, right? So that's going on, and it's very encouraging to see that Anthropic in the deep learning space has been, talking about sparse autoencoders, which is a very interesting notion when you go into, denser networks where there's a problem attributing, the whole black box nature of deep learning, right? And the fact that, a single neuronal layer doesn't quite independently explain to a variable. There's a linear dependency across the system. And I think what's going on that Anthropic's doing there is trying to get a little bit more structure to the network as opposed to the black boxy nature of it. So if you take some of those developments, Elizabeth, I think we might not be there today, but it's really heartening to see that we're going towards explainability and summarization, kind of like we did in the early statistical days, right? We went into like principal components analysis where we were trying to harness across a stream of data, how do you kind of acquire some explainability to a hierarchy of explanation, right? You see the same thing with confidence scores. There's increasing expectation now, and I think we'll soon be in the day and age where we will have not just predictive accuracy in models, but confidence scores, right? Can I actually believe the data that's predicting my accuracy? And so, I think it's maturing, and I'm very optimistic about this evolution because as everything progresses and we're seeing a lot more research papers being published in these domains, I think I saw the graphs that were shared with the 4 economists things. I think that's what's going to lead to that point of inflection, change in utilization of AI, particularly in algorithms.
Navi, I see you nodding your head. Can you share the optimism?
Absolutely. So I'll take a very consumer-based example of this. Can we trust machines? Listen, I drive a Tesla. I trust my Tesla to do 99% of the driving for me. Not the 100%, but I trust it to do 99% of the driving for me. It's the confidence scores. The underlying machine learning models, we can train, we'll continue to train these. We're working with our organization these days They are specializing in clinical trial data. Clinical trial data is all over the place when it comes to the variety, the veracity of the data assets. So the more you train it, the more you can trust it over a period of time. And today, the results are producing is 99% accurate. Those are fantastic. Will they be 100%? Who knows? Tesla is on a scale of 1 to 5 too. I'm sure most of you guys understand that. They have aspirations to get to 5 anytime soon. God knows.
We can't talk about trusting machines to make, human or critical business choices rather without getting into the ethical implications. And at the end of the day, the accountability factor, which comes up in a lot of our AIM leader council meetings, right? Who at the end of the day is accountable for all of these. So Scott, I want to start with you. What are the ethical considerations that companies need to be keeping in mind? And at the end of the day, who should be accountable?
Yeah, thank you. Ethics is a huge issue today in AI overall, and in generative AI especially. And it's one of the things that drives what is a trust issue. So we may feel comfortable, but the people walking out there in Central Park may not trust AI. In fact, surveys say that most AI is not trusted by consumers. And part of that is because a lot of AI is unethical, right? They're built quickly, they're not well understood. Even the basics of algorithms such as explainability, shopping methods are simply not sufficient for certain types of decisions that make a critical life decision associated with a consumer or an individual. And so this is a serious business. And for me, right, I know we can trust machines. We use these machines today. They power most of the payments networks. They power things like the Teslas. Right? There are areas where we can decide what the trust is, but when you're not in control of making that decision whether you will trust that AI, it becomes much more of a serious issue. And that's why there's this concept of responsible AI, which has been around for about 7-8 years. It focuses on concepts of AI being built robustly, explainably, ethically, and audibly. And most of those standards are not met today by generative AI and often not met by AI in general. And so when we talk about ethics, it's around making sure that we're not using AI because it's the shiny new thing, especially generative AI. It's around defining the problem and understanding whether we actually need to use it. That's number one, right? There are many applications where we don't have to. It's already been discussed, like human in the loop, how critical that is. Every critical business decision needs a human in the loop, period, right? In the development of an algorithm, the monitoring of those algorithms, and then the review of those algorithms. But for things like generative AI, right, it's much, much more complicated, where we do not have control of what data was used to train these models. And so many organizations will look at things like generative AI today and say this is different than the neural network technologies we use, right, where we have full control of the data. We may choose not to use that, or if we are going to use generative AI, we have to control everything about it and build these small language models ourselves from scratch, right, and not have to put guardrails around these technologies to feel comfortable using it. I think when we look at ethics, we have to make sure that we're making the decision correctly for an individual, not on average, right? And I think very often we don't have those conversations, but it's a critical part of getting down to that ethics and demonstrating, right, that we're not discriminating against one group versus another. And right now, isn't that great for generative AI? We don't have control over many of the ways that it responds. And there's been studies over studies which would say do not use it because it discriminates against race and gender and background and location. And so we have a lot of work ahead of us, and part of that is asking, is this the right tool for certain types of high impact decisions and ethical ones that need to be made?
What are some ways that your organization is thinking about this?
Yeah, so I think it comes down to the governance element of a lot of the use of these technologies and assets. I love the way Scott described it, right? So we may trust it. The general masses out there who are not as deep into it, they don't trust it as much. I think one of the main challenges that we face when we work with some of our customers is that many a time people have good intentions of using these platforms, but many a times they are not aware of how some of these platforms are going to interpret or what data assets you're uploading and so interacting with it, right? So there is the
Right.
enable the organizations to be more ethical in nature, they are governed. So those are some of the challenges that we face.
Right. But we're still testing, and we're still trying to put these guardrails in place. That said, as we're testing, what are we learning as we go from either some of the successes that we've had or some of the failures that we've faced, and how is that shaping how you move forward in your organization and continue to explore generative AI initiatives? And Ken?
So as we are still very early in the overall adoption of the generative AI, I don't think the learnings are quite there yet. And people, especially in regulated industries like ours, we're conservative in how we think about the usage of these techniques for all the reasons that Scott has said before. But if you think about it, the way we are thinking about productivity enhancements, starting from, you can really have an agent-based model to really look at a RAG-based agents to look at internal tasks first, right? Knowledge workers, internal tasks. You can have a lot of agent-based things to external consumer-facing. We're not there yet, right? We want to test with internal-facing, so we minimize the impact, and we want to test it with a smaller user group, understand and monitor, and be able to look and understand from it. But specifically speaking, as long as you are using RAG-based approach and limiting the amount of the data the facets of data that you provide to it, and things it's good. Using a general model for an externally consumer-facing use case that is broad in nature and not very specific is a problem right now. So it depends on the business risk and the reputation risk that you're willing to take, right? So I would say crawl, walk, run. Internal productivity-based use cases that are RAG-based, that are limiting the amount of data. But there's a lot of internal data. If you think about just a platform that our users use to do all of these, we have thousands of pages of documentation. A new person onboarding into the document, it can be an agent-based search engine to be able to find them to, how do you do this data validation? How do you connect that? How do I do this? How do I do this? There is thousands of questions one can ask, and it's working beautifully in those use cases. So to me, how do you crawl, walk, run, and provide the use cases in terms of its impact, and how you can control that impact, how you're monitoring all of that. So we're still in internal productivity-based enhancements that are still using RAG-based this thing. So there is a lot of area to cover there.
Yeah.
Just that, so think of companies with tens of thousands of associates and employees, and productivity boost 10%, 20% to those internal employees is a huge opportunity, right? Start there and then go in any external facing applications as you develop these things to minimize the failures. I say it's early innings, to be able to have, hopefully nobody starting out in the out front with the broadest use case possible. You'll have, some of those that went into the Fiddler presentation, and you would have use cases like that. So if you use this approach, I think you would have a lot more control and a governance to be able to react.
Yeah, to your point, the data that we're starting to get back, a lot of focus on the operational efficiencies that we're getting, right? Still very early. So let's shift into the risks associated with the over-reliance on AI. Scott, I want you to talk to this. What are some of the potential risks of over-relying on generative AI for strategic business decisions, and how do you mitigate those?
Yeah, so over-reliance, I think, is a big issue, right? As we, as an industry develop AI models, we are further removed. In fact, the people that use those models are further removed from the data on which it was built, the processes under which it was built, and frankly, people become callous in its use because they have no way of actually understanding or feeling comfortable with how it's been developed. And so, over-reliance is essentially, to say, well, the AI told me so, right? Because it must be so superhuman that it has to be right. And in fact, we all know, right, the great George Box quote that, all models are wrong and some are useful, and that's the way we need to look at this. And so, the biggest risk that we have is that we give up our decision making. That's why we need human in the loop. We need to have standards under which we will allow AI to be used for certain use cases, and we have to have the courage to say that the technology is not sufficient today. One of the things that I like to try to point out, a few things when I talk to people, is number one, not every problem is a generative AI problem. Number two, right, generative AI is not new, right? What's new is the fact that we have these large language models, and they're rapidly coming out of favor for things like fine language models or focused language models or self-built ones. And so why is that? It's because where we are today is not where we will be in the future where we can use these technologies responsibly. So what do we do about that? Well, we have to have a recognition that all the guardrails that we put around technology today is because the technology is not the right technology, not for our use cases, right? And so we need to focus on things like responsible generative AI, which require new algorithms and new standards. Outside of that, right, every organization needs to have a AI model development and governance standard. What I mean by that, and I implemented at FICO, is that we have a standard of how you work with data, which algorithms you're allowed to use or not use. This is how we're going to explain models. These are the type of interpretable models we use. There's only one kind of explainability method. What is the auditability or ethics methods around that? And then every single data scientist needs to use that model development standard, right? It's not dealer's choice based on who the data scientist is. Because you can imagine some of our firms have hundreds of thousands of data scientists, they're all individuals with a science and religion about how to apply AI. That's way too much risk for any one business. And so developing that AI model development standard is a big task. It's something that every organization needs to do. Moreover, right, it has to be enforced. And so what we do now is put that we have that on blockchain. So it is very, very specific around what decisions got made, by whom, when, and so it's immutable so that we have an ability to ensure that, one, you define that standard so you can defend that to your regulators, to your board, to the governance teams. Two, you have things like blockchain, which will enforce that was followed, right? Now we start to be very specific about what we're comfortable doing or not doing. Maybe we're comfortable with RAG, maybe we're not comfortable with RAG, right? Maybe we're allowed to use small language models, but not the large language models, maybe not the private ones. But that is a standard that each organization has to abide by, right? And that will drive trust, it'll drive quality, it'll drive sort of accuracy and fairness in use. Without that, it's going to be the Wild West for quite some time, unfortunately. And we're not going to drive the right progress to where we're going to eventually have to get to as an industry.
Well, I want to take a last couple minutes here to hear from each of you, looking forward, future. What are some advancements that you foresee in this technology that you think can get us a little bit closer? I know we trust our Teslas, right? 99% there. How do we get even closer? Are there specific things out there that you're excited about and are seeing that will help to close that gap a little bit? Maybe let's start with you, Arvind.
Yeah, so I'm an AI optimist. Yeah. So this is an easy one for me. The first one, we're at the tip of the iceberg with multimodal language models. And if you go down to very basic things like, in my industry, we need to understand pain experiences because we're in the disease area. And humans express emotions in a multimodal manner. Today, we still rely on text, and we do not capture the intensity of emotion, the depth of sentiment. And to have a technology that is probably going to mature, that looks at multiple modalities to understand that same experience is a home run. Right? So that would be one. The second one I would mention is synthetic data. Right? Where we have been paralyzed as an industry. Obviously, we would have to do it with a compliance and legal law. But there are entire medical streams out there with imaging and everything else that we've never been able to access because of privacy issues. Right? But with synthetic data, you can go from very restricted data, you can pseudonymize it, anonymize it, and then get to pure synthetic data that gives us new avenues to understand our customer base. Right? So those are two, and that's generative. So I think we have to stop getting too fixated on what we have today, and I just want to go back to failures.
Yeah.
We're in a transformative moment with technology, and you've got to expect spectacular failures. Otherwise, you don't make progress. And that doesn't mean you shut an enterprise down on failure, but we have to get used to the risk benefit. Like, we would never have had Tesla if a car didn't end up killing a person, unfortunately.
Right.
But that's a risk benefit that has to be assessed for the broader good. Right? So I think there are things on the horizon a little bit that I'm very excited. Hopefully it'll be here sooner than I think.
Yeah, me too is synthetic data, not me.
Yeah, so I think to Arvind's point as well, right? So AI is here to stay. And by the way, AI has been around for a very, very long time. I'm a computer science major as well, right? So we've been experimenting with these things for the last 30, 40, 50 years, not longer than that. I think we're in the phase of democratizing AI to the general masses now. Everyone's talking about it. I think the risk that comes along with everyone talking about it is that, to Scott's point, everybody wants to solve the problem using an LLM now. And that mushrooming element, I think, is creating a little bit of a noise in the space that we have to sort of manage and curtail. But the future is fantastic. The efficiency gain that we are looking at from just an agent, a human being trying to service any kind of industry, I think those gains are going to be monumental. What is yet to be seen is, I love this one example that someone said. So a CFO walks in and said, you can give me all the efficiency gain and I'll give you a little bit more funding to make sure that we have the efficiency gain. But if you somehow show me how you can increase the top line by 2%, by 3%, you can have a lot more funding.
Yeah.
We still don't know how we're going to increase that top line to the magnitude where the bottom line doesn't matter anymore. I think those are the real opportunities that we have to explore.
I agree. All right, we have about 1 minute. I want to make sure we have some time for Q&A. Venkat, you want to add one? And then we'll get to Scott.
Yeah, I think as we look to the future, especially data companies like us with thousands of data scientists on my team, we're looking at not every use case is how to use an LLM, right? How LLMs work, how do they, if you go beyond, peel the layer of how we work, the deep learning techniques it uses and everything else, rather than asking an LLM, how to do this, we develop a lot of fraud models. We're in the space of fraud, device fraud, and other things. The LLMs, the way they work, the way they understand language, and how they understand the sequence of words and sequence of language, there are specific techniques that are targeted that we can use some of those techniques to develop deep learning models to understand the grammar of fraud as a sequence of steps and be able to predict what is the next step in fraud. They're very specific, very high accuracy in terms of, rather than going and asking a very generic LLM the answer, the underlying techniques could be useful. The underlying techniques of what LLMs use itself, of how they understand language. So we, some of our data scientists have put out a paper saying understanding the grammar of fraud, using techniques, deep learning techniques that the LLM uses. So there are many ways, it's not always how to use an LLM and a generative, this thing, but there's a lot of things that one can learn in developing very, very complex, multi-step, models in a sequence of events that are very latent and very complex and to be able to understand and predict this is trending towards a fraud, right? So we're investing in these areas as well, where we're being the maker rather than taking an LLM and using it, understanding the piece parts that we really target and fit. That's one area of future that we see.
Scott, last for you.
Yeah, so in terms of future, right, we've entered this stage now where the sort of large language has gone from the height of inflated expectations into this trough of disillusionment, right? That's positive. It's super positive. That means we can get to work and actually use the technology appropriately or adjust that technology. So what am I most excited about for the future? One is I'm excited about the fact that people are recognizing, we've seen this repeatedly in AI, that smaller models are as performant, you have more control over them, you can interpret them better, right? And so, I believe we're going to see the industry moving to using more of these smaller models that they have control over, that they can meet the regulatory sort of guidance around. And coupled with that, we're seeing across the world, right? I have a global business that AI regulation is insisting that we do so. And regulation is not terrible, right? Regulation and innovation live together, and it will drive for better solutions. It'll allow people outside Central Park to trust this technology, and it'll keep us from going through another AI winter, right? Which is now an increasing sort of conversation that occurs today because of this sort of this hype cycle that's generated around it. So I think we're in the right position now, and I just encourage everyone to kind of have those really honest conversations about what the technology can and cannot do and where it makes mistakes, and then plot that strategy for how to get there.
Excellent. All right, well, I think we have time for maybe 2 questions. Does anybody have, I see a hand here. Can we get a mic over to this gentleman, please?
Building on the Tesla as an example, right? One of the problems I see in some technologies that perform well most of the times is complacency. When I got my Tesla with autopilot, I started napping at the wheel first week and started using the autopilot a lot less. And then eventually they caught up with the driver attention type of technologies. How do you see something like that evolving in implementing AI solutions for business decision making, where you don't want to overload the users with a lot of friction, but at the same time, if you make it frictionless, then complacency sets in and maybe you make one blunder, it's reputational and cost concern.
I can take that. So that's a great question, by the way. So it's going back to the same analogy, right? So what Tesla is also trying to do is to make it safe for us, so we don't become complacent. And every time I'm complacent, I look at my cell phone and it gives me a warning. It's like, you can't do that. But one of the greatest challenges that we face is the efficacy of some of these solutions, some of these AI models that we put out there, and see in the long term how are they going to behave, how are they going to scale in the long run, right? Because, again, this whole advent of LLMs has created this euphoria that everybody wants to do something with it, right? But we don't know in the long run how are they going to really help scale the businesses. But if you let them be as is, the chances are bright they are not going to scale. So you have to continue to evolve, you have to continue to tweak, you have to continue to monitor and manage. And that's how we will know that they are, number one, they're learning and we're managing them well over a period of time as well. And that's how businesses have to operate. And again, it goes back to the governance in place. You have to have the right mindset. I love the morning session, right? It's not just the how, the why, right? You have to have the why in front of you all the time, because the moment you deviate away from the why, the how will decay over a period of time. So it's a continuous learning process for all of us to evolve with that. I think is the key word here.
Well, gentlemen, I want to thank you for joining us this morning. It's time for lunch, everybody. I encourage you to network with these 4 gentlemen, and we look forward to the rest of the day with all of you.